Do flood insurance rate maps lie? The answer is yes, they lie all the time. You might be surprised to hear that. I'm a land surveyor. I deal with flood hazard issues all the time here in Central California, especially in the Central Valley. And I know what I'm talking about. And I'm telling you, FEMA flood maps lie all the time. So, before we figure out why do they lie and what do you do about it, let's just real quick, what is a flood insurance rate map? A flood insurance rate map is a special kind of map prepared by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and it basically describes the flood hazard risk for a particular area in the United States. So that's what it is. It's a map that shows your flood hazard risk, and they divide different types of flood risk up into different types of zones, and then they show you where the zones are. Okay, so why do flood maps lie? Why do flood insurance rate maps lie? I'm going to give you 5 reasons why flood insurance rate maps lie. Okay, number 1, some of the maps are just old and they don't reflect current conditions. A lot of the maps were done a long time ago. A lot of the flood studies I look at were done 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, and they're just old and they don't reflect current conditions. Things change, climate changes, topography changes, stuff gets built, floodways get modified, So that's one reason why flood maps lie. Number 2, flood maps aren't always drawn at an accurate scale, so they're not detailed enough. Or the topographic surveys that were used to create the flood maps weren't detailed enough, and so when you're designing maps at a large scale where there's not a lot of detail, stuff gets missed. Sometimes a flood map will miss a whole creek, a whole stream, a whole levee. Things just get missed, especially under if you're in a heavy vegetated area. It's hard to see things. A lot of those flood maps are done with what we call aerial photogrammetry, making maps from aerial photos. So they're not always super accurate at a detailed scale. Sometimes the flood study isn't accurate. Flood study was done a long time ago, and the flood studies weren't super detailed. Maybe they only cut a channel cross section every mile instead of every quarter mile, or they didn't do flood cross sections at all, and maybe some creeks or streams were left out of the flood study. So sometimes there can be issues with just having a flood study that's not very detailed or accurate. Sometimes there's no flood study at all. So a particular river or stream or a particular area, maybe there wasn't a good flood study. And so in some cases there may not be a map. So large portions of the peninsula and the Bay Area, there's no flood maps. Or there's a flood map, but people are taking educated guesses. They didn't have really good data to rely on. And then the 5th reason flood maps lie is GIS is dangerous, and there's unqualified people that use GIS, and a lot of that information that used to be on hard copy flood maps is now available as a GIS data layer. And if you have people that are ignorant, they don't know what they're doing, that data can easily be misinterpreted. And I've got a story I could tell you about something that happened in Stockton to a homeowner, but I'll save it for another video. But GIS can be dangerous, and the data that is taken from flood maps and converted into GIS data layers, that conversion process introduces some errors, and it can be misunderstood and misuse that data. Okay, so now that you know why flood maps lie, gave you 5 reasons why they lie. And when I say lie, I mean, they either say that somebody's in a flood zone when they're not, or they say somebody's outside of a flood zone and they're really in the flood zone. So why do they lie? Talked about the 5 reasons why they lie. So the next question, logical question I get from a lot of people is, well, then why doesn't FEMA make better maps? Let's make maps that don't lie. Well, yeah, that's a great idea, but there's some problems with that. Okay, the first problem is the cost of making super accurate flood maps for everywhere in the United States would be huge. It would just be a huge cost. It'd be great for land surveyors because we'd get a lot of work, but the cost is just huge. And as a federal taxpayer, I understand that the cost benefit. The cost benefit balance just isn't there. When it comes to flood risk, mostly we care about structures, and mostly we care about urban areas. And if you think about most of the area that we would do flood maps for in the United States, most of it is rural and most of it is not covered by a structure. So, a huge percentage of the land area of the United States, I don't know, 95%, 99%, but we'd be spending a whole lot of money and for not a lot of return on the investment. So we mostly care about structures in urban areas. Conditions change, so you could go in 2020, you could spend $5 billion doing all these super accurate flood maps, and then 25 years from now you got to repeat that work because conditions have changed. And then we talked about cost benefit. really the cost to remove a structure from the flood zone should be borne by the person that owns the structure, because they're seeking the benefit. And so the taxpayer shouldn't have to spend billions of dollars to do that. So FEMA does the best they can. They make a reasonable effort with those flood maps. They typically will take a conservative position. So if they're not sure if it's in or out of the zone, they'll put it in the zone. And then they tell the landowner, the structure owner, if we made a mistake and you want to get your structure out of the zone, we'll do that, but you have to pay for the cost. As a taxpayer, I think that's reasonable. So there's a process for that. FEMA has a process where you as a landowner can apply to have your structure or a portion of your property removed from the flood zone. We can do that with what's called a LOMA or a LOMAR. And those are a little bit different. I talked about that in a different video. Now, that does sometimes lead to some duplicated costs. So you may have a couple landowners, that are next door to each other or that are across a stream from each other that both have to go in and do that process, and there's some duplicated costs there, so it's not always super efficient. But that's typically rare. And if you're in a community with good leadership on the flood management side, a lot of communities, if they have an area where there's a lot of homeowners that have been improperly mapped in the zone, they will go in as a community and they will get that flood zone remapped, and they will pull multiple structures out of the zone at one time. That takes a local government that's really thinking proactively and really looking out for the interests of their citizens, but it does happen, and I've worked on projects like that. So, to conclude, flood maps lie. They lie all the time. Don't trust them. And what I like to tell surveyors is, the flood map is a good place to start your investigation. It's not where you end it. You need to get your boots out on the ground. You need to look at the site conditions. You need to check out the flood study. You need to switch your brain on, think critically, think logically. Work with, if you're not a land surveyor, you need to work with a good land surveyor to understand the flood map. I would urge real estate professionals, engineers and architects to use extreme caution when they're making recommendations to a client based on a flood map that could have large financial consequences. Be very, very careful. You really want to know how to critically examine that flood map before you make recommendations to your client. And, to sum up, find a good land surveyor that you trust, work with them to really understand your flood map, work with a land surveyor that understands what information on a flood map is helpful and when flood maps lie, because flood maps lie all the time.